thank you very much for joining me tonight. It means a lot to see a lot of your faces here, and I feel very privileged to be able to give this talk and have this many people show up. So thank you. I'm going to nervously hold my notebook, but probably ignore everything I wrote down as I talk. Mostly I wanted to talk about three different things tonight. One is the mentorship that I was awarded last year with Susan Day, an artist from London, Ontario. And then I wanted to talk a bit about the process of creating this artwork and then the meaning behind this artwork or where that came from. So last summer, it's actually only almost been a complete kind of cyclical year finishing up Susan Day's mosaic, which you can view kind of adjacent from this space. Afterwards. I think it was maybe like 10 days difference when we completed hers, so it feels very kind of full circle. But I did start that mentorship back in March of 2022. Susan and I met on Zoom for the first time, and that's where our relationship kind of started to build. And we really started to talk about public art, what public art meant to her, what public art meant to me. And then I embarked on a trip all the way to London, Ontario, to meet her in her studio and work in her studio. And I remember being extremely nervous about that trip because we were these two different people that had never worked together, taking on kind of 8-hour days full on working in her studio together, being super nervous about how that was going to go. And I remember us having a conversation ahead of my flight saying, okay, let's work in the studio during the day, but in the night, let's go our separate ways and have supper on our own, or you can have your own time and I'll have my own time. But as soon as we met at the airport, we clicked immediately. And for the entire, I think, 21 days that I was in London, Ontario, we were inseparable. And we worked in the studio for 8 hours a day, then we went to the beach, or we went art viewing in London, Ontario, or we ran workshops that were part of another project that she was doing for the London Museum in London, Ontario. And so it was just, a really great friendship that immediately took off as soon as I arrived. Ceramics were not really a material that I had worked with all that much. So this mentorship was kind of brand new in so many ways for me. And working in her studio, I was taught a lot of different techniques and approaches of how she took on this tile making. We had kind of like a running joke about the reports that we were going to write about each other at the end of the mentorship. Sometimes I would make, a mistake in the clay, and she would remark, "Oh, well, that's going in the report." But also at the time, she had just moved studios, and she was just building her own studio in London, Ontario, so there was no running water, and there was a porta potty that had to be used. So that was definitely going in my report about the mentorship for her. And she also made me fly with a chunk of clay from Plainsman, from Lethbridge to London, Ontario, because we wanted to test my clay that I would have access to here with her glaze to make sure that they were matched. So my suitcase did get searched, and I'm sure it wasn't the weirdest thing that they've seen, but it was the weirdest thing that I've ever flown with, was a wet chunk of clay. Soon after working in her studio, she packed up all her clay pieces and started the voyage to Lethbridge by truck. So she had packed it all up in boxes, had lots of cardboard and tape to secure the larger pieces, and she trekked across Canada to get here with those pieces. And we began installing just at the beginning of August. And so that was a whole another ball game of learning how to install ceramic pieces. We were working outdoors in the heat. It was 8-hour days starting at 7 a.m. and then just staying in the sun as long as possible. I don't know if you remember last August, but it was much like the weather today, but constant. And so that was really tricky, learning about how quickly the mortar would set or how quickly the grout would set under those kind kind of really, really hot conditions in the blazing sun. But again, I learned a lot through that process, and even though it was a year later that I would be installing my work, I had that kind of tactile remembrance of the consistency the mortar should be, or the consistency the grout should be. And it's one thing to like watch a YouTube video and learn about how to install tiles, but it's another thing to actually have that experience in person. And that mentorship meant a lot to me through the Allied Arts Council and the city of Lethbridge, to have that experience, that one-on-one experience, and go through that tactile remembering. So that felt really, really fortunate. What else did I want to say? Oh, I forgot to mention that while I was in London, we also did a lot of art viewing. We took a driving trip to Detroit, and we did some art viewing there as well. So talking a lot about looking at public art in different cities and what that looked like in London, what that looked like in Detroit, and then following it through and doing some art viewing here when Susan came and looking at what public art looks like here. And feeling really, really fortunate that I live in Lethbridge with a super supportive art community, and having the opportunity to take on a public art piece of my own. So our mentorship kind of officially ended September of 2022, but we created this friendship that I could text or call Susan, at any time, and she was willing to answer questions, and we met on Zoom throughout the year as I was taking on this project. So even though that mentorship is not really like a mentorship, an official mentorship anymore, she's definitely acted as that person in my life still going forward. And up until, we talk like 2 days a week usually, and she sent me like, good luck for tonight, and we're gonna Zoom tomorrow, and so it's kind of be a lifelong relationship, I'm sure. So then I had the privilege of starting this work and being shown this space last summer, and then given the kind of space and the time to think about what I wanted to create or what I wanted to propose for this work. There was a lot of considerations for me. Some of the bigger ones was what the space would be used for, that it was directly adjacent to Susan's work, which felt really great, but then also the colors of the walls that were on each side was a big consideration. And I thought about, should I ask to get those repainted? Like, should they be white? How am I going to take that on? And I actually left color as like one of the last things I wanted to figure out as I was building this mosaic. I worked out of CASA in Lethbridge, so the community clay room there, the clay studio. And so my approach to this mosaic and Susan's approach were really different, because I had to kind of navigate the challenges of being in a community space, having to pack away everything every time I was done working. Susan had a large studio where she had everything laid out all the time, and she cycled through all the different stages. When I was there, we were making the tile pieces in the wet clay. She had stuff coming out of bisque fire, and she had things that were already glazed. And the approach that I took, I felt like I couldn't take on the mosaic in that same fashion. So I ended up deciding to make all the clay pieces and then put them through bisque fires as they were being made. And then I stored them all until I was ready to glaze the entire collection of tiles. I don't know yet if that was the best way to do it. It was difficult because I never at one point had my mosaic laid out, right? I was never given the confirmation that, okay, this was going to be the layout of all the tiles, because I had them packed up in little boxes here and there, and I was given extra storage space at CASA, and they were really amazing to work with, but I still had that challenge of having them packed in these little boxes and kind of going through my head thinking, do I have enough of that one style of tile, or do I have enough of that other style? Are these larger pieces, is that going to be enough? Do I need more larger pieces? Do I need more smaller pieces? So that was a challenge for sure. I imagined I imagined kind of ignoring at first the colors of the adjacent walls and going with kind of more earthy tones, but somewhere in the making of all these tiles, I decided to take, rather than kind of fighting those colors, I decided to take on the colors of the walls and include them in the scheme that I have here. The process, and the other thing that I didn't mention was a year ago, just as Susan was arriving in Lethbridge, my stepdad passed away. And I had to make the decision. Of course, everybody was really, really considerate and offered time off to not get that, to be able to grieve and take that time. But I think I was actually really fortunate to have that mentorship and that time installing with Susan Day to use as a process to work through that grief. So those 3 or 4 weeks that we were together, there was amazing times when Susan's husband and I and Susan were working in really close quarters because we were fighting the heat and the sun, and we had to work really close and get things done, and the conversation was just flowing, talking about memories and family. And then there was other times where I was isolated and I was working on one side of the wall and they were working on the other side of the wall, and I could go through that kind of mental process as my body was busy that entire time. And I could really process my grief. So I think I was super lucky at that time to have the art to work through it. And I think that grief and having that kind of resiliency led to my concept for this piece, and seeing the resiliency of my mom, who is here tonight. Thank you for coming from Calgary to see my work, seeing her work through it as well, and push through what was a really difficult time with kind of grace, and I'm really proud of you. So yeah, the idea kind of behind this piece, A Similar Nature, which is the title of my piece, was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. A similar nature because it's a similar nature to Susan Day, right? It's difficult to not incorporate some of the things that Susan taught me and I experienced through that mentorship, so kind of tongue-in-cheek. My mosaic is a similar nature to her mosaic, which is in the same park, but also thinking about that we all face times of crisis, we all face emotional or circumstantial upheaval. I'm reading this now because I'm going to forget. A state of instability brought on by social, economic, or political change. And in these times, people often look to nature to summon hope. The handmade ceramic tile and mirrored glass mosaic installation encompasses motifs of abstracted local flowers and plants growing triumphantly from the mirrored cracks in the pavement. Just like the strength of the flora, individuals and communities have a similar nature to push through and become majestic survivors with the power to persistently flourish. So that's what I did is I took my inspiration from the flora in the Lethbridge region, but kind of abstracted. Sometimes I would look at leaves, or sometimes I would look at petals, or sometimes as a bunch of flowers growing in the coulees. Milkweed was a huge inspiration for me. I love milkweed, and I love all the stages of milkweed. It seems kind of funny, but that was a really big inspiration. But I also loved the hairy leaded thistle, the scarlet butterfly plant, the nodding onion were ones that I really looked at closely. Yeah, and then I guess the process of actually installing the work, Erin was amazing at getting all my firings through the glaze. Well, actually all the firings, but I'm sure he had a few chuckles at me because I had a few panic moments as I was putting the clay tiles up, and I realized that I had missed an entire box and I hadn't glazed or fired that. So Aaron was getting panic texts from me, and he was amazing at taking care of me and making sure that I got all of those pieces before my grouting, kind of that schedule I had in my head to get the grouting done. So thank you, Aaron, for your help there. It was a little bit different than Susan's, and I had to take a different approach than Susan, because this wall wasn't a load-bearing wall. So I had to think about installing a different material on top of the wall that was drilled into the studs before then installing each tile one by one on the wall. So I ended up going with a Curdy board, or Curdy boards, that I had to source from Calgary. They're kind of a special system made for tiles, made for installing tiles, normally in a bathroom or a shower, because they're water resistant, but they're super lightweight, so that seemed like the best solution. And then there was a lot of research. Even though I had mentored with Susan, I had changed the material, which meant then I had to change the mortar, which then I had to kind of change the grout, or I had, I guess, a few different considerations for the mortar and grout I had to really research and source out. So there's a lot of questions about where did you start, or did you have this planned out in your head ahead of time, like where each tile was going to go. And I took a very intuitive approach to the installation. So when I was glazing, I imagined the colors that I was going to use, and then I kind of intuitively glazed so many yellow or so many blue or so many green. And then I brought all my tiles here and I laid them out in bunches. So this entire floor was kind of covered in tiles. And then I started installing just the big pieces to start with. So the blue flower here, the green ones up there, the purple ones, and then some of the bigger leaves. And once I had those in place, I bought a box of colored chalk, and I started drawing on the board to decide where I kind of wanted things to flow, or where I wanted the big circle to be. And so there was a lot of drawing, and then standing back, and then thinking, and then erasing, and then drawing, and then standing back again. And then once I kind of got the bigger pieces and a bit of the flow and the mirror pieces on there, then I was really just filling in the space with the smaller pieces that I didn't plan exactly where any of those pieces would be. So I could just kind of intuitively start filling those spaces with the different colors I wanted, or the different designs that I wanted. The other thing I had to do was learn how to cut glass on the fly in this space. So that was really interesting. So Susan had sourced kind of strips of glass, and so I did know how to just really quickly score and break the glass. But sourcing that in Lethbridge was going to cost kind of over $500. And so I decided I would get a pane of glass, which I didn't have to pay to get it cut, and I would learn how to cut the glass. So that was a really interesting experience, and a lot of YouTube videos again, and trial and error on this floor, with some glass getting wasted and not being able to be used. But now you need some glass cut. You know who to contact. Yes. Because I know how to do that quite well now. I think that is kind of the different parts that I wanted to touch on, but I'm open to answering questions, because some people said they had questions. So is there anything that I can answer for you in the audience? Well, Susan and I are meeting this week because there's a call that we might be applying for as a team. So we'll see how that goes. So that's like a little bit in the distance. I do see ceramics being a tool in the belt of my art practice. I don't know if mosaics are going to be what I focus on. I'm not going to pass up an opportunity if I could answer a call for a mosaic, but I do want to explore ceramic in a more sculptural way. That's more my background is sculpture. Susan has a lot of kind of illustrative work in her tiles, where I have more kind of, I guess, like when I made the stamps, I thought of them a little more sculptural. I did try drawing a few things, and those got thrown out or recycled, because illustrative was not my strong suit. So I thought of things about carving pieces out rather than drawing on them. So I'm definitely interest in where else I can go sculpturally with ceramics. Yeah. Yeah.
Sitting back here, there's definitely moments of like really high relief and real low relief in terms of the textures. Would you mind just talking a little bit about the different approaches that you had with making the impressions in clay?
Yeah. I'm going to put this down because I don't need it anymore. There was a lot of kind of trial and error when I first started out. So maybe some of you don't know that the approach that I had and that I learned from Susan is making your own stamps. So you take the wet clay, you make whatever design you want, you bisque fire it, and then you can use that to stamp into the next set of wet clay. And it can be used hundreds of times, if not, well, if you don't break them. Which I did. So it was quite intuitive for me to start out because I didn't know, at the very beginning, I didn't know what the concept was going to be. I didn't know what my kind of identity in the clay tiles was going to be. And so there was a lot of trial and error, and the beautiful thing about clay when it's wet is that you can try something, you can hate it, you can crumple it up, you can recycle it, you can use it again. It's one thing that I really loved about the clay. And so I would just make stamps. If I fell in love with that stamp, it would get bisque fired, and then it would make its way into the tiles. Sometimes I used some of the motifs over and over again, like in different ways. So you'll see that this one's on its own, but it's also kind of in this, I call this the gear piece. I wanted to bring in some ideas about using my hands to make the textures, so not everything is stamped. So these pieces, these flowers here were pinched with my hand. These flower pieces were just pulled with my finger, so my fingerprint is in the clay as well. Again, this one is pinched and then just kind of punched. There are some that are not kind of pre-stamped. They're made one-ofs. But yeah, I would spend a lot of time thinking about what my identity or what I wanted to see and how I wanted that to speak to the audience. I guess the other part was thinking about what this space is used for. So I knew it was a community space. When we were installing with Susan, we saw birthday parties here, we saw a retirement party, we saw families getting together, family reunions. And so I really wanted the mosaic to speak to everybody from 2 years old up or anywhere in between. And so I did include some kind of fun pieces like the ants or some flies, which I thought would speak to a certain audience, or little kind of gems here and there. There's only, I think, 2 dragonflies. There's 2 frogs. There's a bit of a DNA mosaic or motif that runs through some of the pieces, and that's just referring to the concept of us being like these flowers. And yeah, did that answer? Yeah, good. Any other questions? Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Josie. Yeah.
I was just wondering, looking at those leaves there, whether you have references to ancient plants, considering we have so many fossils here.
That's true.
And that sort of.
I did spend some time looking at older illustrations of plants. I have the name's Ernest something. Yes, some of his. I do have a book that I picked up in Detroit, actually, at the library there, that I would often flip through. I was thinking about how I wanted the next tile to look, so there was probably some influence of that coming through his plates and his illustrations. Yeah.
Just makes for an interesting time from present to eons back and everything in between.
Oh, sorry.
I knew it was going to be good, but I didn't know it was going to turn out. This is my preamble. Can you just walk me through the physical process of putting a mosaic together, like from putting things on to how it looks now?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned before there's a curdy board underneath, so I had kind of a frame to work with. And then each tile is put on individually, so I mix up a batch of mortar, and so I have to kind of guess like how much mortar to make before it's going to dry out, because you don't want it too dry, you don't want it too wet. So I mix a kind of a small pail of mortar, and then you do what's called buttering. You butter the back side of the clay tile, and then you butter where it's going to go on the board, and then you kind of do this squishing thing as you put it together. A few of the pieces are too heavy to stay in the place that they're set when the mortar is first put on, so then I taped. So especially like those big flowers up there or some of these pieces, I would have to put a piece of tape on, let it set and dry a bit. So yeah, as I kind of alluded to before, I started with the bigger pieces and I put those on first, and then I moved to like the circle and put those on. And so it did get a little bit tricky in the end because some spaces were really small, and you have to be careful with the grout. You can't have too big of a gap between the tiles or the grout is going to crack. So it did get a little bit tricky at times where I had smaller spaces that I needed to get the mortar on the wall and on the back of the tile and try to stick it on. And then once everything is installed, all the pieces are on the wall, then the grouting happens. And my experience with grouting was just with Susan last summer. We were working against the heat of the sun, and so we could do just a really small section. Like we could only do this amount of section at once because the sun was so hot it would start drying the grout. So you cover the entire surface, the surface of the tiles with the grout. You have to wait for it to get to kind of a certain dryness, and then you start brushing it off. And you have to brush it out of every nook and cranny of all the tiles. If you don't do it in time, there's the chance that the grout is going to stay on that and you won't be able to get it off. So there was a kind of a time clock happening when we were doing Susan's, but I found out that in an air-conditioned environment, I could do a much larger section and not be kind of racing the time. So I did a really small section to start with, and then I stood back and I waited 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and it still wasn't drying. So then I knew that I could kind of cover a really large section and then go back to the beginning to start scraping all that grout out of the nooks and crannies and then wiping it off at the end. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, so there's lots of different versions of mortar, there's lots of different versions of grout. I didn't have to go with as heavy a duty because mine's indoors and I don't have to worry about the elements. I don't have to worry about freeze thaw and all the things that Susan had to deal with being an outdoor mosaic, so I could go with a less heavy duty mortar and grout. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, speaking of indoor, outdoor, did you use a low fire and she used a mid fire or higher fire?
She did a cone 7, I did cone 6. Yeah.
Even low fire would work.
Yeah, I mean, I think indoor, I don't know everything about mosaics, but from my experience, there's a lot of flexibility when it's indoors. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, in terms of the material.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought you meant the board.
Oh, no.
Do you know if ceramics expands or contracts in hot and cold weather outside? Or is that a consideration when you make a mosaic outside?
I think so. I think that Susan had to use a grout with flexibility an industrial grout, yeah.
They're trying to
Yeah.
freeze and thaw.
Yes. Yeah, and she did lots of tests because actually climactically we're similar to London, Ontario, but she also did some tests like in the freezer and then thawing quickly, like 30 times, so like a month of testing before she decided what to use for her outdoor mosaics.
So how did she color hers?
Her tiles, I would say hers has a more blue grayish base, and then she has pops of yellow and oh yeah, they're so she has a base transparent glaze, and then she either uses mason stains or other chemicals to color them.
So she wasn't too worried about ultraviolet being outside.
No, no, they should last a long time. Yeah. Yeah.
Was there any specific inspiration behind like the animals and insects that were chosen?
I did spend a lot of time kind of in looking, well, when Susan was here, because this was a much different environment for her, we spent time outdoors looking at different plants in Lethbridge, so that kind of inspired me. And then I also went online and looked at a lot of different plants that often grow here, but I always went back to milkweed. I don't know why. Any other questions? Yeah.
How long did the process take you from start?
Ooh. It feels like a blur right now. But I would say I seriously started working on the mosaic like on a daily basis. I think it was back in April. And then I installed in July. Yeah, so it was a really quick turnaround. Erin voiced concerns.
When are you gonna get this target?
Yeah, about my turnaround, but
Installed this summer? But actually, I have one question around that.
Yeah.
Is basically, like, I came and saw it, Alan, I came and saw it, obviously you remember that name, and that was part of the blur. And it was like 2-3 days before the deadline. And it was, in my estimation, you know, you had the curry board on, you had none of, you know, you're just starting with the mirror at that point, and there was maybe half the tiles on the wall. So I know you had a deadline of 2 or 3 days, 2.5 days later. Did you get it done? Or did you get an extension a little bit?
so there may have been a day that I was here till 5 in the morning. Maybe. So there was an issue with grout. So I started grouting, and I estimated it would take me about a day to grout. And I bought 2 bags, and my second bag of grout had gotten water in it somehow. And so once it's clumpy, you can't use it. So it was like already past, I don't know what time, it was past like business hours at that time, so I couldn't go buy another bag of grout. And so the next day there was a group in here, so I couldn't finish my grouting that day, but I finished it the next day. Yeah, so.
I'm just like, the grouting alone seems like I once used pasta as a grout, mistakenly. Very hard to scrub.
Yes. My arms were exhausted after doing all the grouting. Yeah,
It's all worth it in the end.
exactly. Thank you. Yeah, Julian.
So you participated in the first mentorship like this that
Yes, that's right.
the program has funded, and you've spoken a bit about the skills that you've learned, and obviously it helped you create this beautiful piece. I'm wondering if you could speak kind of on a higher level some of the other things that you learned as a result of the mentorship and working with Susan about public art, about what it means to be an artist today, what your own art practice, things like that.
Yeah, I would say the mentorship has, changed my art practice forever. I didn't really consider applying for any public art before this mentorship, and now I'm actively looking for calls because my confidence is there. Obviously completed this one, and so I feel like I can go bigger and get better, right, continuing. But working with Susan Day, she was extremely generous in having conversations about anything and everything that I wanted. when I was in London, Ontario, she threw like a cocktail party, and it was all artists and curators from that area. So even, I have new relationships and new connections in a faraway place, or what seems like a faraway place. And so I feel like I'm expanding my skill set and my artist practice outside of Lethbridge, where Lethbridge has been my comfort zone, and I'm confident in applying things here, but I wasn't confident in applying outside of Lethbridge, so now I am. And yeah, Susan and I are looking at some calls, and there's another call that I'll probably try for in another city coming up. Yeah, so it's definitely given me that base to jump off from. Yeah.
So I'm just assuming Susan's not on Lethbridge, she's based somewhere else.
Right, she lives in London, Ontario.
And the next project that you guys plan on doing or want to do, do you guys have like an idea to be in a specific city, or will it be in London?
We're not there yet discussing all of the details, but that call is in Ontario, so I would be having to go there on a regular basis, throughout the year. But we'll see. That's, you have to put in the call first and hope to be shortlisted, so that's like, there's tons of artists applying for those, you never know. But just the idea that we have this like relationship and we're willing to take on artworks together, that our relationship is that strong, and that we worked that well together is really exciting.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So in your studio practice, it's very contemporary and sculpture driven, the public work is very much about placemaking. How do you see those two things synthesizing or informing each other?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I don't know if I've processed how that's all going to work together. I definitely took on kind of a more sculptural, I think, feeling mosaic than I imagined in the beginning. And I feel like I'm going to try to push ceramics into my art practice, not just the public art side, but my day-to-day studio practice, and use it as a material and see kind of where that can go. But I don't know yet how much it's going to play a role in my art practice. But I think it's just about knowing a new material and knowing that they could be used if, right? Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you. Thank you again for all coming. It was lovely to have you here.